This is the most commonly asked ChatGPT question, and this is the two-step process that will transform it into something that delivers results 10 times smarter. The tool I'm using is a custom GPT trained with data from all major platforms on prompt engineering, which means those dumb ChatGPT answers are a thing of the past, because now no matter what prompt you start with, it can transform it into one that ends your frustration in just a few clicks. Now, let's compare these two prompts side by side. On the left, you've got the typical kind of prompt everyone defaults to, and sure, it will deliver an answer, but a mediocre one at best. But on the right, that's the same prompt just run through our turbo prompter, and the answer you'll get from this one will be a whole lot smarter. The difference comes down to 5 key building blocks. It gives the AI a role, a task, context, constraints, and the format. So in the next few minutes, we'll break this prompt structure to understand why it's so effective and how ChatGPT's brain really works. And the first building block is giving the AI a role. In our example, the role assigned by the turbo prompter is a tech journalist who explains AI concepts in clear and engaging language. But that's not just a nice label, and to really understand why, you've got to take a look at this image here. What you see is essentially a 3D representation of an AI model's brain, obviously on a much smaller scale. Each dot represents a neuron, and each line represents a connection. So when you type in a prompt, your words are converted into numbers or tokens, which then ripple through this massive web of connections. Now, without a role, the model has to light up and explore far too many pathways at once. And that's when it leans into generic, middle-of-the-road patterns, because it has no clear direction for which connections to prioritize. But when you assign a role, in our case a tech journalist, you are telling the model exactly which areas of this network to activate more strongly. You are sort of guiding it towards patterns, vocabulary, and examples that align with that persona and away from all irrelevant possibilities. So let's suppose this node right here represents a tech journalist in the model's mind. And looking ahead, as you can see, there are still plenty of possible pathways, although not quite nearly as many as before. Of course, a tech journalist can still approach the job in millions, if not billions, of different ways. That's why we move on to the next building block, which is giving it a task. In this example, the task happens to be identical to the simple prompt. It says, explain what ChatGPT is and how it works. But the only reason they are the same is because the original question was already clear and coherent. Personally, most of the time when I talk to ChatGPT, I'm nowhere near this neat. And if you are anything like me, what you type is full of and you know what I mean? More than the actual point alone. What's great about using the turbo prompter, while it's still best practice to keep your questions clear and concise, it doesn't really have to be perfect. It will shape your question into something that captures the important parts, even if you ramble a little along the way. Okay. Back to our example. As we previously said, this node represents a tech journalist, and now we give it a task to explain what ChatGPT is and how it works. That instruction alone lights up every part of the network that is relevant to the topic. At this point, it is ready to give us an answer, but with the number of paths that still remain open in front of it, it is probably gonna be generic. That's why with the next building block, we will start adding more details to narrow it down even further. Now, let's zoom back into our example and compare these two prompts side by side. You can easily spot that the turbo prompter's version has 3 critical context clues the original does not have at all. First, it says the explanation is for general audience with no prior AI knowledge. Second, it's framed as a part of a beginner-friendly blog series on new technologies. And third, the wording hints to the AI that it should keep the tone friendly and the ideas easy to understand. Going back to our model, as you remember, we still have quite a few pathways in front of us. But now I wanted to show you how the context we just added starts to shape the response that's going to come out. In our example, knowing it is for general audience means you will skip technical terms and use simpler explanations. Knowing it is a part of a beginner-friendly blog series encourages you to keep the structure clear and the tone interesting. And with that hint to be friendly and easy to understand, the AI will choose words and examples that make the topic less intimidating. You see how these details may seem small, but they remove a big chunk of useless pathways, leaving only the ones that lead to the kind of answer we actually want. But there's another problem here. As you probably know, sometimes a chatbot gives answers that go on far too long, and other times he's just plain lazy. Sometimes he throws big fancy words you don't really need, and other times he dumps things down so much that leaves out important details. So this is where our next building block comes in. Think of constraints as little guardrails on that neural network, guiding it on what it can and what it cannot do in the answer. And they can cover all kinds of things, from the tone to the level of details to the length, and even whether to include or avoid certain topics. But I think our example will show this perfectly. So if we take a closer look at the constraint section of the prompts created by the turbo prompter, here's what we find. First, it sets the length limit of 300 words, and this forces the answer to stay short enough to be focused, but still long enough to fully cover the task. Next up, it defines the tone as friendly and non-technical, making sure it sounds like a chat rather than a lecture. It also asks for an everyday analogy, which makes the explanation relatable to anyone. And finally, it tells the chatbot to skip talking about competitors. This one seems a little confusing at first, but if you think back at the task, the goal was to explain what ChatGPT is and how it works specifically, not give a rundown of every other LLM out there. Alright, we are almost at the finish line here, and if you look at the model now, you can see we are very close to having a really smart prompt. However, the last building block is every bit as important as the ones before it, and that's the format of the answer. See, you could have the same response written as a short essay, a bullet point list, or a clear two-section breakdown, and there are plenty of other formats too, but each one would feel completely different to read. So if we go back to our model's brain representation, the role, the task, the context, and the constraints we've previously set have already lit up the right spots, cutting out tons of useless connections and getting us very close to the perfect answer. The format simply decides how all that work is going to be structured and then delivered. But you don't need to worry about picking the format yourself, because the turbo prompter will pick the one that works best for your question. So if you've ever been frustrated with ChatGPT, chances are it's because of the prompt. You didn't ask it the right way. So step 1, go to the turbo prompter, drop in your ramble, and let it restructure it into a properly designed prompt using everything we've talked about so far. Step 2, open a new chat, paste it in, and hit enter. I almost guarantee the answer will be 10 times better than what you got before. I'll keep updating the data, and also I'll build other GPTs for daily use. So if you are interested, you know what button to click.